I'd like to begin by acknowledging the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island who lived here before and live here now. We who also live here now do so mindful of our responsibility to create and sustain respectful relationships, and we seek to do that in what we do as a center through the way we teach, the way we communicate, and the way we do our work. This lecture today is named for the founder of the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies, Professor John Llewellyn J. Edwards. We are grateful for the co-sponsorship of Woodsworth College and the Faculty of Law in hosting this event. I'd also like to acknowledge the attendance at today's lecture of members of the Edwards family, Alex Stenning and John Barlow. Thank you for being here. John Edwards was the inaugural director of the Center for Criminology when it began in 1964. Professor Edwards wrote and taught about many subjects in his long career and also advised government and law commissions on a range of criminal justice issues. I can also report a little-known fact that strangely doesn't appear in his biography, that I was a student of Professor Edwards in his first-year criminal law course. And my recollection of the course, apart from really being terrified of being called upon, was that it was a fairly doctrinal course. That is, very kind of traditionally about the rules and the doctrine of criminal law. And yet here is what Professor Edwards said in an interview in 1975. I've come to the conclusion that the criminal law does not have within itself all the answers to its problems. All the related fields of knowledge must be explored to see in what way they contribute to solutions. And I think that the spirit of Professor Edwards' remarks, both in the way he was open to interdisciplinary interaction, communication, and mutual learning, even though his particular approach happened to be quite doctrinal, is something that continues to inspire and animate the Center, now the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies, a title encompassing not only the domain of crime and criminology, but also law and regulation in the broadest sense. Our faculty and students, who are indeed practitioners of interdisciplinarity, explore not only solutions to the problems, but also new questions to ask. This year, it's a great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Prabha Kotiswaran of King's College, London, who will present this year's Edwards Lecture, The Sexual Politics of Anti-Trafficking Discourse. Professor Kotiswaran was educated at the National Law School of India in Bangalore, Harvard Law School in the United States, and also practiced law in New York. She is the Professor of Law and Social Justice at King's College. She's authored or co-edited several books, including the award-winning Dangerous Sex and Visible Labor, Sex Work and the Law in India, as well as 2 volumes of Governance Feminism and Revisiting the Law and Governance of Trafficking, Forced Labor, and Modern Slavery. Professor Kotiswaran is currently the principal investigator on a European Council grant on social reproduction, where she will explore surrogacy, erotic dancing, sex work, paid and unpaid domestic work in India. And finally, I'd like to mention that along with our colleague Mariana Valverde and our incoming colleague Kamari Clark, Professor Kotiswaran is co-editing the Routledge Handbook on Law and Society. In a recent interview, Professor Kotiswaran remarked that I think deep down within every sociolegal scholar is a desire to be an activist. And I think Professor Kotiswaran's long-standing and continuing work with communities and feminist collectives around issues of sex work, trafficking, and most recently, social reproduction in the broadest sense, in India and elsewhere, testifies to her commitment to supporting, advocating, and producing change. So it is my great pleasure to present to you today Professor Prabha Kotiswaran.
Audrey, thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to give this talk and share a few of my thoughts on the sexual politics of anti-trafficking discourse. So I will quickly pull up. So it is 2019, almost 20 years since the UN Protocol on Trafficking was negotiated in Palermo, Italy. It is fair to say that the anti-trafficking field has gone from an early, almost exclusive preoccupation of trafficking with sex work, seen in this poster here, from the early 1990s, to addressing exploitation in various labor sectors. So we fret over the use of slave labor, quote unquote, in the production of basic commodities like tea, sugar, coffee, prawns, chocolate, and cotton. We hear of exploitation in wartime captivity in Nigeria, bonded labor in Pakistan, fishing boats in Thailand, households employing overseas migrant domestic workers, Qatari construction sites with Nepali workers, the brick kiln industry in India, and Brazilian garment factories employing Bolivian workers. So this might suggest a reduced focus on the nature of the work performed and a greater focus on the conditions under which it is performed. However, 20 years on, anti-trafficking discourse remains in the grip of the myth of the innocent girl duped into prostitution against her will. So this is a more recent poster. And it's a myth that continues to colonize our imagination such that it can interpolate us no matter where we go, at airports, shops, and sports events, and through primetime TV shows, Hollywood movies, and the mainstream media. So in today's lecture, I explore whether understanding the sexual politics of anti-trafficking discourse can help us at a time when the fight over the differing positions on sex work is intensifying around the world, when the carceral effects of anti-trafficking law are accelerating, and the spread of the Swedish model shows no signs of abating. So my lecture will consist of 4 parts today. I start by giving you a quick snapshot of how anti-trafficking law and policy have developed at the international level, reinforcing rather than diffusing cultures of sex work exceptionalism. Then I share the account that feminists give for the persistence of neo-abolitionism, or the desire to abolish sex work. Next, I consider how sex workers are mobilized to counter its carceral paradigm and the implications this has for proposals for redistribution within sex industries. And I conclude by tracing how the sexual politics of anti-trafficking discourse, as it has emerged in the global north, is anchored in the global south. And along the way, I hope that assessing the shifting registers through which these sexual politics are sustained will throw light on strategies for the future. And I want to clarify at the outset that by sexual politics here, I do not mean the political economy of sex on the whole, but rather the politics of sex work. So sexual politics has been core to the framing of anti-trafficking law, policy, and discourse since the 1900s. Today, however, I'll speak only to the most recent wave of activity around the issue. As you will know, since the late 1990s, an extensive transnational legal order has developed to deal with trafficking. It is built around the 2000 UN Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which in turn supplements the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which was adopted in 2000. Now, negotiated within 2 years at lightning speed on the UN clock, the Trafficking Protocol was adopted in 2000, and it came into force in 2003 and has been exceptionally well ratified by 173 countries to date. Now, specifically, we can discern at least 3 phases of the development of this transnational legal order over the past 20 years. So there was a phase between 2000 and 2009, which was the heyday of sex work exceptionalism. And then there is a phase between 2009 and 2014 when closer attention is paid to labor trafficking, rendered visible by the competing frames of modern slavery and forced labor. And from 2014 onwards, we find that there are legal interventions which are framed explicitly in terms of modern slavery and forced labor, and they began to be enacted at the national and international levels. So neo-abolitionist influence on the trafficking protocol negotiations has been well documented, so I will not go into it here today, except to say that the initial years of the trafficking protocol were marked by sex work exceptionalism. And what do I mean by this? By this I mean A, the characterization by neo-abolitionist groups of the sale of sex for money as an egregious violation of human dignity and as an exceptionally harmful activity. And B, the overwhelming association of trafficking with trafficking for sex work and with sex work itself. And a clarification here about the term neo-abolitionism, as neo-abolitionists model themselves after 18th century abolitionists of slavery like William Wilberforce. Now, by 2009, anti-trafficking laws, which earlier defined trafficking only in terms of sex trafficking, defined it to cover labor trafficking as well. And from 2012, we find that trafficking became increasingly reframed in terms of modern slavery, a new term coined by sociologist Kevin Bales, and which became the basis for the Global Slavery Index, published by the Walk Free Foundation, founded by the Australian mining magnate and philanthropist Andrew Forrest. This is found purchased with the UK and Australian governments, which have recently passed anti-modern slavery laws. The term forced labor, meanwhile, also assumed significance in this phase, with the 1930 ILO Convention on Forced Labor being updated with the 2014 Protocol to the Forced Labor Convention, with a view to targeting forced labor in the private sector. However, the definitional relationship between trafficking, modern slavery, and forced labor is unsettled, and it is still unclear whether trafficking is a subset of forced labor or if forced labor is a subset of trafficking. Similarly, is trafficking the umbrella term or is modern slavery the umbrella term? It is not clear yet. Now, less interested in definitional niceties than institutional survival, the International Labour Organization, or ILO, joined hands with the Walk Free Foundation to produce the Global Estimates of Modern Slavery, or GEMS, in 2017, focusing on forced labor and forced marriage. Where definitions cannot be settled, these organizations have fallen headlong into the measurement game of estimating how many modern slaves there are in the world. The new frontier for law reform, meanwhile, lies with laws on supply chain transparency on corporate accountability. So during this 20-year period, at least 4 approaches to trafficking have emerged. So the first approach is the criminal law approach, which views trafficking as an exceptional aberration to otherwise normal circuits of commerce and exchange in a globalized world, thus warranting the use of the heavy coercive hand of the criminal law. The human rights approach seeks to mitigate the harshness of the criminal law regime by bolstering the human rights of victims of trafficking. We then have the labor approach, which understands the difference between the exploitation of workers and trafficking as a matter of degree, not of kind, and points to the role of restrictive immigration laws and deregulated labor regimes in producing structural subordination and exploitation. The labor law approach also focuses on root causes of structural inequality, as this image shows. Now, the development approach takes the debate back to the role of the state in effecting redistribution and to problematize the hegemonic understanding of development in the Sustainable Development Goals and its target 8.7, which is devoted to eliminating trafficking, forced labor, and modern slavery by 2030. So an example here is of the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is operative in India and has been shown to reduce vulnerability to distress migration and extreme exploitation. Now, the Trafficking Protocol itself is part of and has spawned a dense transnational legal order encompassing international law treaties, regional EU law, and soft law, including codes of conduct, corporate social responsibility initiatives, naming and shaming techniques, and operational and ranking-based indicators. There are also bilateral and multilateral government agreements, as well as multi-stakeholder dialogues, the latest being the 2018 Liechtenstein Initiative for a Financial Sector Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking. Now, since the protocol's entry into force, the number of countries criminalizing trafficking saw a near 5-fold increase, from 33 in the year 2003 to 158 in August 2016. However, despite its prolific development, conviction rates have remained stubbornly low. So the UN Office on Drugs and Crime claims that the criminal justice system response is stagnating at a low level. However, the success of the concept of trafficking lies in its remarkable resilience and adaptiveness over the past 20 years. So Terence Halliday proposes the idea of a plausible folk theory, as he calls it, to describe the anti-money laundering legal order, but which applies equally, if not more aptly, to trafficking. So he explains, a plausible folk theory is built not on robust empirical foundations, but on parsimony, face validity, a compactness of rhetorical expression, sufficient ambiguity to accommodate potentially conflicting understandings of what it purports to explain, an affinity with extant beliefs about such things as crime and dirty money, and a failure or resistance to examine too closely the premises and logic of the theory itself. So, in technical terms, the number of states that criminalize both sex and labor trafficking in domestic laws increased from 10% in 2000 to about 73% in 2013. Now, despite this, cultures of sex work exceptionalism are alive and well. And this is because the Palermo Protocol allowed countries to regulate sex work as they saw fit. So there is a complex interrelationship between at least 4 sets of laws. The general criminal law, which likely has provisions on obscenity, indecency, kidnapping, abduction, buying and selling of persons, and slavery. Then municipal laws on public nuisance, anti-sex work laws, and now anti-trafficking law. So sex work exceptionalism is operationalized in at least 6 different ways. So there are some countries like Brazil which explicitly define trafficking in terms of sexual exploitation. So extreme exploitation in other sectors then comes under the local concept of slavery. And so this is the most obvious form of sex work exceptionalism. Then we have countries like Romania which have a general trafficking offense, but which is qualified, so that a person who is determined to engage in or continue the practice of prostitution through coercion shall be held liable for pandering. So in other words, the law distinguishes between innocent victims who are trafficked into sex work and willing sex workers who are not legally innocent. Now, many other countries which are signatory to the Trafficking Protocol adopt the Article 3 definition selectively. So here I just want to share with you the definition of trafficking in Article 3. And there are at least 3 elements that need to be proved for the trafficking of adults. So there is an action element, which includes transporting or movement or harboring. Then there is a means element, which includes fraud, coercion, deception, abuse of power, abuse of a position of vulnerability. And finally, the purpose of trafficking, which is namely any one of those various forms of exploitation which is listed in Article 3. So it includes slavery, practices similar to slavery, the exploitation of the prostitution of others, forced labor, and so on. Now, the term abuse of position of vulnerability was particularly vague and is considered to be a compromise term that radical feminists inserted into the protocol so as to cover voluntary sex work as well. Now, in the case of children, the coercion element does not have to be proved. So we find here that some countries like Mexico and Bulgaria have removed the means element from their definition of trafficking, thus equating adult sex workers with children. Now, in most countries, though, even if the domestic law defines trafficking as per Article 3 of the protocol, extending beyond trafficking for sex work, in practice, anti-trafficking strategies primarily focus on sex workers. So how does this exactly work? So the state can either choose to ignore enforcing the anti-trafficking law and simply enforce the anti-sex work law. But assume that a government in fact enforces the anti-trafficking law only where women and girls are trafficked into sex work. In such a scenario, the law does not necessarily benefit victims of trafficking. And this is because the protocol does not require the criminalization of the victim for the offense of trafficking, but does not exempt the victim from being prosecuted for offenses committed when trafficked. So the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights issued principles and guidelines in 2002, which call for human rights protections for victims of trafficking. But these are not binding, and states have enacted highly unsatisfactory non-criminalization clauses. So typically, immunity from criminal prosecution is available only for serious crimes perpetrated as a direct consequence of the coercion applied by the trafficker. Thus, in a US study covering 12 counties, victims were shown to have been arrested in 59% of all state-level cases. And these were all for low-level prostitution-related offenses. Now, despite professed concern displayed by neo-abolitionists for sex workers, who they consider trafficked anyway, there is actually very limited protection for them. So I used 2 examples to illustrate this. So in California this year, an amendment was passed to the Evidence Code to disallow evidence as to the conduct of sex work, where the sex worker is the victim of a violent crime that occurred during the course of the act, or where she can provide testimony as a witness to such a crime. Now, in effect, she need not fear being prosecuted or arrested for prostitution, as a violent crime includes sexual assault, human trafficking, stalking, robbery, and so on. Similarly, New York City's human trafficking intervention codes, which were set up in 2013 with a view to harm reduction and to promote decarceration rather than incarceration, has some interesting insights for us. So rather than be sent to jail, sex workers here can avail of an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, as it's called, or ACD. Now, if they complete the mandated program and are not rearrested within a period of time, typically 6 months, then the charge for violating anti-sex work laws is supposed to be dismissed and all records of it sealed. Yet judges in these courts, who seem so compassionate that they viewed all the sex workers coming through their courts as being trafficked, given their difficult life situations, when asked why they wouldn't support decriminalization, they had no response to this and evaded the question as one being meant for the legislature. So what we find is that as long as anti-sex work laws are on the books, the police will continue to arrest sex workers, whether they are trafficked or not into sex work. So in the words of Anne Gallagher, an international lawyer and champion of the Trafficking Protocol, and I quote her here, "It is evident that trafficking for sexual exploitation receives the lion's share of criminal justice attention and resources in most, if not all, countries." Now, I go back to my previous slide. The fifth way in which we find sex work exceptionalism being operationalized is that the Trafficking Protocol has provided the impetus for the Swedish model, which criminalizes demand for sex work, which is in turn has been adopted by several countries in the past 15 years. So this is invariably a move towards further criminalization of sex work. Although in countries like South Africa, with a fully prohibitionist system, the Swedish model, ironically, is a minor rollback on criminalization. So if you look at the countries that have adopted the Swedish model, they include South Korea, Finland, South Africa, Iceland, Norway, Canada, Northern Ireland, Spain, France, Lithuania, the Republic of Ireland, and most recently Israel. And last but not the least, we have countries like India, which have sought to pass anti-trafficking laws that ostensibly deal with extreme exploitation in several sectors. But actually, if you look at the law, they're baked in the crucible of the anti-sex work law. And this produces quite absurd results because the anti-sex work law often has a provision, say, for example, to shut down brothels. And when you apply this to other quote-unquote places of exploitation that comes under the trafficking law, then you could end up with a situation where you're trying to close a farm or a household where forced labor is used. Now, as documented by sex workers groups around the world, trafficking has thus become a reason to escalate the already prevalent brutalization of sex workers, resulting in enhanced police profiling and heightened surveillance, entrapment, repressive raids, forced detention in government facilities, the persistent risk of arrest and deportation, and increased vulnerability to exploitation and violence. Now, what makes this association between neo-abolitionism and trafficking so enduring? In her new book, Brokered Subjects, Sex Trafficking and the Politics of Freedom, Elizabeth Bernstein argues that we need to go beyond the explanatory framework of the sex panic to understand contemporary anti-trafficking discourse. So she theorizes the sexual politics of anti-trafficking discourse in terms of the influence of carceral feminism, militarized humanitarianism, and redemptive capitalism. So carceral feminism, in her words, is a cultural and political formation in which previous generations' struggles for gender justice and sexual liberation are recast in terms of criminal justice. Militarized humanitarianism, meanwhile, refers to neo-colonial humanitarian interventions in the global south, using undercover raid, rescue, and rehabilitation missions on the part of Western anti-slavery crusaders to save third world women from third world men. Finally, we have redemptive capitalism, which aims to solve the problem of sex trafficking as a way of distracting us from the poor labor conditions within its post-Fordist working arrangements, but in the process really extends its surveillance over sex work. So Bernstein complicates the strange bedfellows thesis, whereby radical feminists and evangelical Christians find themselves in alliance. Instead, she shows that the alliance between the two groups, and this is certainly true for the US, is facilitated by a rightward shift of mainstream feminists away from a redistributive model of justice, and the leftward move of younger evangelicals away from polarizing issues such as gay rights and abortion towards a globally oriented social justice theology for which trafficking is supposed to child. This, she claims, is sutured in place by a new politics of sex and gender, where both groups, according to her, prioritize the affective heteronormative family form, which already shoulders greater care responsibilities in neoliberal times. Now, feminists, she claims, have stopped problematizing marriage and the family as a site of oppression, focusing instead on threats to the family from the outside. And both these groups also support market-based agendas for gender freedom through social entrepreneurship, consumer humanitarianism, and global corporate citizenship. And both groups converge on their reliance on criminal justice responses to social problems. And here Bernstein draws considerably on several scholars' work on neoliberal penalty. Now, sociologist Nicolas May similarly explains the spread of neo-abolitionism across Europe, based on his extensive ethnographic work there amongst migrant sex workers for over a decade. And he uses the term sexual humanitarianism to refer to the global emergence of a neo-abolitionist epistemology that legitimizes targeted forms of control and protection of social groups defined as vulnerable in relation to their sexual orientation and behavior. So according to him, sexual humanitarianism is an understanding of gender and sex which is influenced by the convergence of neo-abolitionism, neoconservatism, and neoliberalism. So he characterizes the export of the Swedish model as an example of model gentrification on the part of the global north. Now, Bernstein and May's intuition that the resilience of anti-trafficking discourse cannot be attributed to a sex panic or to accidental alliances that result in unintended consequences or collateral damage is quite compelling. Their account of carceral feminism is particularly telling when we look at the latest initiative of the New York Human Trafficking Intervention Courts. That courts view sex work as trafficking is predictable, even if problematic. But judges and activists in these courts also argue that given the socioeconomic profile of sex workers appearing before them, their decision to do sex work comes from being abused at home or in family-like relationships, say with their pimps or male lovers, therefore amounting to domestic violence. So the McKinnon idea of rape, trafficking, child prostitution, and domestic violence as all being proxies for female sexual subordination comes alive here in a spectacular fashion. Now, as compelling as this account of the sexual politics of anti-trafficking discourse is, it needs to be qualified on two fronts. First, to explain for the growing strength of the international sex workers movement in alliance with the influential liberal medical establishment as they contest neo-abolitionist discourse in the corridors of UN organizations, in courts, in academic peer-reviewed literature on HIV, and on the streets through political struggle. Second, if this complex alliance of social actors based in the global north derives at least some legitimacy from its international ventures of militarized humanitarianism, what then sustains these projects abroad? I'll address both in turn. I'll start by detailing the growing visibility and successes of the international sex workers movement, while also probing its critique of anti-trafficking discourse and the implications this has for redistributive projects within the sex sector. In particular, I will demonstrate the high opportunity cost of engaging with the anti-trafficking complex by considering how the movement deals with issues of exploitation, regulation, and internal hierarchies. Then I draw on the Indian experience to trace the path that neo-abolitionism has taken there and why the fortunes of global governmentality in the global south might produce quite unexpected outcomes. So in the past decade, the international sex workers movement has made extraordinary strides. Now, we only have to recollect as recently as the 1980s, where Mariana Valverde offered a snapshot of the sex wars as follows. So very pithily, she tells us about the sexual pessimists and the optimistic libertarians. So she says the pessimists emphasize the pervasiveness of male sexual violence. And for them, gender is the main, indeed almost the only category in their analysis. And the gender division is presented as absolute and unchanging. Now, the libertarians, on the other hand, according to her, assume that sexuality is a natural force that has been bottled up and suppressed by social regulation. And she claims that for them, gender is not as important for sexuality in hers and the individual alone. And Mariana wrote this in 1987, and that was the same year that the book Good Girls, Bad Girls was published, where Laurie Bell spoke of how feminists and sex workers met at a potluck dinner in Toronto to debate the very terms of their engagement, even though they were in different rooms of the same house because the sex workers smoked, but not the feminists. So we've come a very long way from the 1980s with various iterations of the sex wars, starting with the issue of pornography, then sex work, and now sexual assault and the Me Too movement. And their specific discursive and material configurations, they vary across geospatial and temporal contexts. Now, in relation to sex work itself, there have been various shifts in the theoretical orientations of feminists, how they engaged with each other and with sex workers, and mobilizational repertoires of the sex workers groups around the world. Now, what began as a debate of feminists versus prostitutes, quote unquote, or sex trade workers, quote unquote, or sex workers, morphed into contestations between radical feminists on the one hand versus sex-positive feminists and sex radical feminists, sex workers on the other hand. And there was a postmodern moment in the debates in the 1990s, but also, perhaps surprisingly, a materialist feminist turn. So radical feminists, for instance, pretended to offer an economic theory of sexual exploitation, while sex workers claimed that they were materialist feminists too, and chose sex work under constraints imposed by capitalist patriarchy. Now, fast forward 20 years, alongside the Swedish model, the sex workers movement has grown from strength to strength. Now, there have been substantial achievements furthering the rights of sex workers in various parts of the world. Even in countries like the US, where most states adopt prohibitionist laws, we have seen immunity from prosecution for sex workers under limited circumstances. In South Africa, another prohibitionist regime, a court upheld a sex workers' right against unfair dismissal, even though sex work is criminalized there. Now, in countries that were not prohibitionists, and many of these are in South America, governments and courts have recognized sex work as work. So in Mexico, constitutional challenges yielded positive results, with the government recognizing sex workers as non-salaried workers and acknowledging the distinction between sex work and human trafficking. Sex work is recognized as a form of labor in Nicaragua, as well as in Colombia and Guatemala. And in all these three countries, sex workers' unions have been recognized by the Ministry of Labor. Argentinian sex workers also succeeded in having local laws that criminalized sex workers repealed, and fought for the repeal of a code in Buenos Aires that authorized fines and arrests of sex workers. In Brazil, sex work is an occupation recognized by the Ministry of Labor and Employment, and buying and selling sex are not criminalized, and sex workers are represented on state and federal anti-trafficking councils. So consequently, in Brazil, anti-trafficking discourse is set to start with a disclaimer that not all prostitution is trafficking. Now, these achievements are matched by organizational presence. So in India, for example, there are two networks. There's the National Network of Sex Workers and the All India Network of Sex Workers. And each of these networks have dozens of sex worker groups as their members. Further, there are international sex workers networks like the Network of Sex Work Projects, now called the Global Network of Sex Work Projects, which has 273 member organizations. And actually, if you look at the Global Network's website, you'd be hard-pressed to distinguish it from that of an international NGO. It has a strategic plan for 2016 to 2020. It has a theory of change, a monitoring and evaluation framework, which is very familiar to development practitioners. Now, testament to the strength of the international sex workers movement is the fact that there has not been a stronger international voice in support of decriminalization than we see today. So numerous international organizations have called for decriminalization, many of them being UN entities. So these include the WHO, UNAIDS, UNDP, UN Women, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, several special rapporteurs, including the Rapporteur on the Right to Health and Violence Against Women, and you can see several other UN organizations on there. In addition, there are civil society organizations, including the Open Society Foundation, the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, Human Rights Watch, Lambda Legal, ACLU, and Lancet. And all of this momentum was stopped by Amnesty International's call in 2016 for the decriminalization and depenalization of sex work, even in the face of pressure from neo-abolitionists. So Amnesty categorically stated that criminalization and penalization have a foreseeably negative impact on a range of human rights, and you can see the list that they've presented here. Now, upon a closer reading, the Amnesty report offers a holistic perspective into the radiating effects of criminalization on the lives of sex workers in relation to state violence and the violence perpetrated by stakeholders within the sex industry, but also in relation to societal discrimination. And so the report focuses primarily on sex workers' civil and political rights, but recognizes their socioeconomic rights as well, by insisting that the state provide a right to social security, so that those who don't want to rely on sex work have alternatives. It also expands the policy vocabulary on sex work by introducing concepts such as de jure and de facto prohibition to cover not only criminalization on the books, but also penalization under administrative and municipal laws. So Amnesty argued very clearly that decriminalization is not adequate and that depenalization is actually essential, and that states should not impose blanket criminalization conflating trafficking and sex work. So the amnesty policy is therefore an extraordinary victory for sex workers' struggles, and in the years to come, groups can powerfully marshal the policy in domestic constitutional litigation. Under the surface, however, the Amnesty International policy and explanatory notes have a rather thin understanding of coercion, consent, and exploitation. So consent is defined as a voluntary and ongoing agreement to engage in a particular sexual activity in the absence of force, deception, fraud, and abuse of power. So it's very much like the definition of rape. Now, Jane Schooler has cautioned that rights are not just about democratizing power, but are themselves a mode of power, which we must use with great caution. Indeed, if we take every right that amnesty says is offended by criminalization and flip it around, you could argue that sex work violates all of these rights of women who do sex work. Also, there is no critique in the Amnesty report of the anti-trafficking paradigm. Instead, it is the very distinction between voluntary sex work and trafficking, which is coerced, that enables Amnesty's robust claim for the decriminalization of sex work. Now, some of the weaknesses of Amnesty's policies also affect the international sex workers movement. So at the outset, it is remarkable to witness how feminists and sex workers around the world have come together to comprehensively document the negative effects of anti-trafficking discourse. So just in the space of a few years, we find a 6-country empirical study of sex work commissioned by GATW, published in 2018, 2 special issues of Anti-Trafficking Review on sex work, at least 3 special issues of the Open Democracy blog, Beyond Trafficking and Slavery and Sex Work, and a Red Umbrella Fund study in 2016, which focused on 13 sex work organizations in 9 countries to look at sex work. And the Amnesty International report as well was based on empirical study of sex work in 4 countries. Now, sex workers groups have also produced domestic reports on trafficking, including the 2018 report called Raided by an Indian group, Sangram, and the 2012 report Hit and Run by Bangkok-based sex workers group Empower. Now, I have to say that these reports are quite an accomplishment, but there's something common, a common thread that runs through all of them. They're all quite formulaic in demonstrating the negative consequences of anti-trafficking policies for sex workers, and in insisting on the distinction between trafficking and sex work and between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. They demand a role for sex workers in the lawmaking process, without which they claim governments will lose an important ally in the struggle against trafficking. Now, to be sure, with the advent of the protocol, sex workers groups had to divert their focus from supporting sex workers to producing a critique of anti-trafficking discourse, one which has fallen on deaf ears, leading to despair and burnout. But this critique, which is being rehearsed in all these reports, is so smooth and predictable that it illustrates the highest cost yet of anti-trafficking discourse, namely how it prevents valuable research and strategic thinking on redistributive justice within the sex sector. And here I want to interrogate the movement's theory of exploitation, of regulation, and internal redistribution, which I believe a mature sex workers movement must address going forward. Now, in the desire to critique anti-trafficking discourse and draw the line between force and consent, one is hard-pressed to detect a theory of exploitation in the reports of sex workers groups. So we need to literally read between the lines. So consider the following quote from the GATW report, where an Indian NGO is protesting the raid, rescue, and rehabilitation strategy of neo-abolitionist groups in the state of Maharashtra. As one child of a sex worker said, "I'm so happy that our younger children are getting educated and have alternative ways by which they can earn their livelihood without necessarily coming into sex work. When a woman wants to give up sex work after her children are working, is that not rehabilitation?" So, battle-weary from the trafficking debates, we are conditioned to read this statement as a rejection of neo-abolitionism's focus on rehabilitation with a view to abolishing sex work. But from a redistributive standpoint, we should instead be asking, if in fact the goal is to exit from sex work on one's terms, then doesn't removing the state from the sex sector go only halfway towards realizing this goal? So we thus need a better understanding of how sex workers can earn more within sex work. Now here is another example where Danielle from New Zealand offers a pithy critique of anti-trafficking discourse. She talks about how the sensationalist images of sex trafficking, of being chained to a bed and being raped for 12 hours, actually detracts from the kind of exploitation that she's facing, which is the exploitation of long working hours, uncertain pay, of management trying every trick they can to scam every dollar out of you that they can, and so on. And this extract highlights Chantal Thomas's legitimation critique, which is that by focusing on the sensationalist cases of sex trafficking, we mask the mundane exploitation in other sectors, and indeed in sex work itself, as Daniel's statement suggests. So why then are international sex workers groups not studying the political economy of sex work enough to tell us more about the long working hours, uncertain pay, and devious management techniques in New Zealand, which is often held up to be a pioneer for decriminalizing sex work? So if we read through the several reports that I've just referred, they also talk about the oppressive bar rules in Thailand's sex sector. They talk about alcohol consumption laws in South Africa. They talk about usury laws in Sangli, India, and tenancy laws in London, Mumbai, and South Africa, where sex workers face a routine threat of eviction. So this is not to say that all sex workers groups are silent on exploitation. Thailand-based Empower, in fact, applied the ILO's decent work parameters to their own working conditions. And the South African group Sweat has also drafted a counter sexual exploitation and sex work protocol. But these initiatives tend to be rare. Now, coming on to the question of regulation, sex workers have rightly rejected legalization in favor of decriminalization to get the state off their backs and avoid onerous regulatory burdens on what is effectively an informal economy. Now, the various reports that I listed above also assert that there is no proof that decriminalization and legalization increases or decreases trafficking, or that it increases or decreases the size of the sex sector. Now, while these claims are made to counter unsubstantiated and alarmist neo-abolitionist claims to the contrary, sex workers groups must rethink their assertions. Because the policy vocabulary has no doubt become more nuanced with Amnesty's report, but the report is still geared towards state criminal law. And the reality is that we already have considerable levels of de facto decriminalization in this sector, and therefore we need a more nuanced assessment of precisely how rule changes to decriminalize or legalize sex work will in fact affect sex workers. And I argue that the results can be quite counterintuitive if one were to launch that initiative. Now, in refining the regulatory vocabulary, we also need to understand informality in criminal justice systems from a comparative perspective. Now, in all of the reports, the Swedish model is held up to represent neo-abolitionism and the New Zealand model to represent decriminalization. And there is some merit, obviously, in referring to both these models. But the unfortunate problem is these are the only two models that the reports refer to. And one has to really wonder whether these models can work in countries with large numbers of sex workers. Because in both these countries, both in Sweden and New Zealand, the total number of sex workers is around 3,000. Now, if you think about other countries like South Africa, we are talking about 153,000 sex workers. If you look at Spain, it's anywhere from 50,000 to 300,000. Thailand, again, 300,000. Mexico, 600,000. And India, 2 million to 10 million sex workers. More likely 2 million, but that's the figure out there. The size of the sex sector must be taken into consideration for reworking a theory of regulation. And in many developing countries, the criminal justice system is under-resourced. And it is no surprise then that attempts at self-regulation have come from these very contexts. So we find self-regulatory boards in Calcutta, we find the Tanta Mukti Committee or dispute resolution committees in Western India. We find an account of the role of gang members in South Africa who resolve disputes in the red light areas and prevent trafficking, and the formalization of this dispute resolution function in Nicaragua through the appointment by the Supreme Court of sex worker judicial mediators. And last but not the least, the reports assume that sex workers comprise a discrete group whose common interests can be served if only we could achieve the right kind of reform. And the conflicting stakes that sex workers have vis-a-vis each other rarely come up, except in the case of migrant sex work, given its link with a far more visible and polarizing issue of immigration. So Ava Caradona of the Crosstalk project in the UK notes, what is clear is that we've reached a historical moment, one in which the political significance of sex worker rights has finally started to gain momentum and traction. That is why it is crucial that we as migrant sex workers address some of the conflicts of interest between the aims and strategies of the sex workers movement as they're currently configured, and the strategies and realities of migrant sex workers themselves. Caledonia claims that even the main demand of the sex workers movement to recognize sex work as work is a double-edged sword for migrants, and that full decriminalization would not help undocumented sex workers in the UK. And this has also led to splintering in positions vis-à-vis anti-trafficking law. Thus, Caledonia claims that the sex workers movement cannot offer migrant sex workers much when compared to the rescue industry, which can offer them access to legal aid, to counseling, to temporary housing, to professional training, and possibly asylum. And as Nicola Mai's ethnography of migrant sex workers in Europe shows, often migrant sex workers would report on abusive recruiters and employers in order to obtain a trafficking visa and then return to sex work. Now, the mainstream sex workers movement in France and Canada have remarkably linked their own demands with those of migrant sex workers. However, we need to also consider the differentiated stakes of non-migrant sex workers and sex markets, as this queries the ethics of representation within the sex workers movement. And although supporters of sex workers are accused less of being brothel keepers or pimps than they used to be, all movements, especially successful ones, need to take stock of which voices are filtering through into the advocacy space and at whose expense. Now, so far, I've shown how an overarching theory of the sexual politics of anti-trafficking discourse has not accounted for the rise of the international sex workers movement, which, while successful in garnering support for decriminalization and critiquing anti-trafficking discourse, is less able to pursue radical politics for redistribution within sex work. Now, in this section, I want to problematize the idea that the Global South is simply a place where neo-abolitionist policies emanating from the Global North play out through militarized humanitarianism. I want to probe precisely the socio-economic and political edifice which mirrors and or refracts Western anti-trafficking discourse in the Global South. And notably, in the long list of countries adopting the Swedish model, only South Africa is in the Global South. So I ask whether a closer look at a developing world context can help us reimagine an alternate politics of sex worker organizing. And so here I want to reflect briefly on the Indian experience. So my starting point for this discussion is Partha Chatterjee's theorization of how the post-colonial state exercises both juridical and discursive power in relation to its subjects of governance and the resultant political relationship between them. So he labels civil society as a limited sphere of action where the elite and a small section of culturally equipped citizens engage with the state through the vocabulary of liberal citizenship. And civil society stands in contrast to political society, where the state secures its legitimacy in relation to subaltern population groups through welfare governmentality. Now, in the space of civil society, we find a rather fragmented feminist landscape, which does not lend itself easily to the narrative that Bernstein offers us of the triumph of casteal feminism. In fact, given a strong materialist feminist tradition in India and its ambivalence on sex work, the Indian women's movement has not prioritized sex work or trafficking in its advocacy efforts. So feminists did not lobby the state to abolish sex work or spearhead end demand campaigns. That abdication of this space has, however, generated a vacuum which was occupied by neo-abolitionist NGOs, comprising both radical feminist NGOs but also conservative non-feminist NGOs who want to abolish sex work to restore the dignity of Indian women and children. And all these NGOs, whether they're feminist or not, are committed to militarized humanitarian interventions. And they invest heavily in raids, rescue, and rehabilitation, which are in turn enabled by substantial USAID funding to counter trafficking. So since 2000, India alone has received $19 million a year to counter trafficking. And these NGOs in turn are supported by various state feminists, the most influential being the Minister of Women and Child Development. Now, sex workers, meanwhile, inhabit this space of political society, and having been at the receiving end of the state's brutal violence through an anti-sex work criminal law, the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, or ITPA, they were also exposed to its softer discursive power through HIV prevention projects. So they used the HIV prevention resources to organize, but were reluctant to focus on law reform. Then, in response to an unfavorable trafficking in persons report ranking, which is issued by the US State Department of India, and its placement in the Tier 2 watch list, the Indian government proposed an amendment in 2005 which would have effectively introduced the Swedish model. And this is when sex workers fought back and they undertook protest rallies to Parliament and mobilize the dissonance at the heart of the Indian state. And they pit the health ministry vis-a-vis the ministries of home and women and child development. So here is an image where they show the ITPA to be a noose around the necks of sex workers. So in this very successful example of mobilizing, they leveraged their status as a high-risk population group who was central to the government's HIV prevention efforts to ward off the Swedish model. However, even then they were skeptical of the law, and so they shied away from even conventional legal strategies for fear of a negative judicial precedent. From the 1990s, however, neo-abolitionist NGOs actively interacted with the state, and just given the paucity of time, I won't go into great detail except to say that these NGOs launched a series of public interest litigation suits and became repeat players before the courts. They would also conduct raid, rescue, and rehabilitation along hand-to-hand, with or shoulder-to-shoulder with the Indian police. So over a period of time, they gained the trust of the state, and the state appointed them to literally every expert committee there was on anti-trafficking law. So in 2012, with the rape and murder of the young physiotherapy student in 2012, these groups convinced the Verma Committee, which was commissioned to suggest law reform. They managed to convince the committee that they should introduce a standalone offense of trafficking to cover voluntary sex work. And this provision almost became law before sex workers groups, again with the help of feminists from the Indian women's movement, were able to push back and obtain a retraction from the committee. But this pushback was short-lived because a lawsuit which was filed by a radical feminist NGO in 2004 came alive in 2015 and became the reason that the government then proposed a highly carceral and draconian anti-trafficking law. And this law simply builds out the penal and welfare bureaucracy of the Indian state and wishes to send sex workers and other forced laborers into rehabilitation homes against their will. Now, this time around, sex workers groups did not have the resources to organize protest rallies to Parliament, but fortuitously, there was a highly problematic transgender bill which was proposed at the same time, and these were the unexpected alliances that were formed to again ward off both bills. So there were protests like this held all over the country. And the bill was ultimately passed by one house, the lower house of Parliament, in 2018, but lapsed before being introduced before the upper house. Now, it would be easy to read the bill's passage as a show of strength for the neo-abolitionists who had the ear of the minister. But I won't go into detail here, but I just want to show you that this statement from the minister is testament to the strength of sex worker organization, because she's very keen here to reiterate repeatedly that voluntary sex work would not come within the ambit of the trafficking bill, and that in fact the bill would pave the way for decriminalization because the drafters were non-judgmental and wanted to offer the right to rehabilitation to the sex workers who wanted it. Now, so going on to Bernstein's claim about militarized humanitarianism, it resonates, although I have to say that although governments and international neo-abolitionist groups often agree over the carceral agendas on trafficking, India as a third world government often protests against these neo-abolitionist groups. So, for example, the Indian government has long resented the trafficking in persons ranking system, has recently protested the Walk Free Foundation's estimates on modern slavery, and has denied visas to researchers from the Walk Free Foundation after the foundation claimed that India had the largest number of modern slaves in the world. And also there are many domestic political opportunities that trigger reform. So it's not all unidirectional trends coming from the global north. And finally, the thesis of neoliberal penalty and redemptive capitalism that plays a significant role in Bernstein's explanatory framework is hard to sustain, I think, even in the West, where the idea has been severely challenged. And it resonates much less so in the Indian context, given very different trajectories of the developmental state and its neoliberal policies. But I just want to say very briefly that the Indian government, being socialist, having adopted a socialist model of development in the 70s and 80s, came up with laws to deal with extreme exploitation, which we would today think of as trafficking. But very ironically, this didn't offer an occasion for the labor movement to form bridges with sex workers groups, because they always thought of trafficking as associated with prostitution. So unfortunately, what has happened is that there's been a real gap between NGOs operating in civil society and sex workers operating in political society, where they instrumentalize the law as a shield, but they've never really proactively used the law to further their rights as workers. Instead, what they've done is adopt the strategies of other workers in the informal economy. And they would often fashion themselves as day laborers, as people living below the poverty line, demanding inclusion in welfare schemes as a needful category, and so on. And even when they demanded workers' rights, they would align with the unorganized sector, such as rag pickers, street vendors, and scavengers. So instead of mounting a constitutional challenge to the ITPA, they have lobbied provincial governments to add sex work to the occupation schedule of the ministries of labor. And the state often is quite responsive to these kinds of demands, although it is completely hostile to appeals for decriminalization, much less workers' rights. So I'll conclude by saying that anti-trafficking discourse has morphed considerably over the past 20 years, with the term trafficking managing to still hold various disparate carceral projects together. Instead of displacing the focus on sex work, the expansion of the anti-trafficking agenda has intensified it, whether through the selective enforcement of anti-trafficking laws or by compelling countries to revisit their anti-sex work policy. Litigation by sex work has often also proved counterproductive, and allies remain few and far between. Feminists are either guilty of commissioning a carceral approach, as we see in the US, or of the sin of omission, as you see in India. Labor movements are themselves quite embattled, and where they are not, sex workers remain the lumpen proletariat, and therefore ignored. And with the benefit of hindsight, we could wonder whether differentiating between sex trafficking and labor trafficking might not have contributed to heightening these cultures of sex work exceptionalism, and whether we should have always insisted that sex work is a form of labor in which trafficking also exists and is unacceptable. But in what some scholars call a post-truth moment, the increased criminalization of sex work appears to be the new normal. And so strategic choices for future action are highly contextual and situational, but sex workers' movement may well have to align with movements for structural reform, such as Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street, as Bernstein suggests in her book, or that they continue to mobilize in political society. So here is a May Day rally in Calcutta that sex workers were part of, where they marched along with domestic workers, agricultural workers, and embroidery workers to demand that they be included in the labor schedule of the federal government. And it is on this hopeful note that I want to conclude.